All right. This is John Paus, and you're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet. Let's draw a card for today and see what the deck holds in store for us. Oh, this one is a favorite. They're all favorites, let's be real. Okay, this is card 52 of Life's Potluck Buffet. And card 52 is a very special card to me. This is one of the most important cards of the deck. It is one of Life's Potluck Buffet's rules. And it is Life's Potluck Buffet rule number 2. And rule number 2 is when it comes to life, we are all Dali. It's a really cryptic rule, not as straightforward as rule number 1, get people's names right, and rule number 3, that story you just told about someone else was actually about you. But rule number 2 is as important because rule number 2 is a rule about liberation. Let me read you the card. In January 1957, the famously mustachioed artist Salvador Dali appeared on What's My Line? On this game show, blindfolded panelists tried to guess the identity of celebrities by asking questions about their work. Dali's ability to answer yes to questions like, was he an athlete? Did he make drawings like comic strips? And was he a writer? Caused amused confusion among the panelists and a great deal of hilarity in the live audience. We are all Dali in the richness of our lives. Understand how you are Dali and find liberation in that fact. The card goes on to ask you to name 5 identities in your current life, and I would encourage you to do that. So think of 5 identities that come to mind in your current life and say them out loud. Better yet, write them down. I find it helps to write these down, especially longer answers. There's one about that we'll talk about in another episode that's about having a historical marker, and that's one that's particularly useful to do as a writing prompt, whether it's you yourself individually or whether you do it with a group of people, maybe a writing group, to get things flowing. So how did this come about that I chose this very special card as rule number 2? Well, when we get to rule number 3, I'm going to explain to you that for me, in my own personal opinion, rule number 3 is the most important rule to be aware of in Life's Potluck Buffet. I know, well, you could say, well, why didn't you make that rule number 1? Well, there's a long story about that, and I'll tell you when we get to it. But rule number 2, I wanted to make it a rule about liberation. The other 2 rules tell you things to do. Well, this is really the card that started it all. When I first thought about the concept of Life's Potluck Buffet and the card deck, I thought about what for me was one of the most helpful and liberating YouTube clips that I've seen. And I used to show this clip at workshops all the time because it gave me the opportunity to get people out of their shells, so to speak. It gave me an opportunity to have people imagine their lives as radically different from their lives as they stood, and to give them license and allow them to imagine their lives as something liberated and wonderfully different. This is a very powerful exercise, and that's the reason it's one of Life's Potluck Buffet's rules, because being liberated in your work life is the rule here. And there are so many ways in which the world in which we all live and our lives as we live them individually have many parameters and many restrictions and predetermined elements of them. This card says, be free, be liberated. For a moment, imagine that those predetermined elements no longer constrain you. And once you have set aside the constraints that you normally live with on a daily basis in your work life, then you are being like Salvador Dali. On the playlist for card number 52, of course, this clip from What's My Line appears. I just love it so because Dali really kind of broke the game. He answered people's questions honestly, and with complete frankness. But the frankness of Salvador Dali was a liberated frankness. So when Dorothy Kilgallen asks him if he was an athlete, Salvador Dali said yes. In the world of What's My Line, a game show about figuring out, guessing people's occupations, and that's how the main part of What's My Line worked, is that there would be a person, say they were a department store detective or a maker of gliders or a denture salesman, or whether they were a judoka, no matter what they were. The point was that the panel would ask questions to guess what the occupation of the individual was. The audience was aware of that because the individual's occupation was revealed to them and the at-home audience and the studio audience when they entered. But it was a mystery to the panelists. This particular segment turned that on its head insofar as this segment that Salvador Dali, among many, many others, appeared in was called the Mystery Challenger. And the Mystery Challenger was a celebrity who everybody would recognize the face of, or even the voice of. So many of them disguised their voices. So that's why the panelists were blindfolded, because they would immediately recognize the person. So they weren't trying to guess their line. Although there's something interesting about this. When Salvador Dali appears, the word artist pops up on the screen as if to say this is Salvador Dali's line. But if you know anything about Salvador Dali, you know that Salvador Dali is Salvador Dali, and therefore an artist, a comic book illustrator, an author, an athlete, and 1,000 other things. Because Salvador Dali's line, because like Life's Potluck Buffet, Salvador Dali understood that his whole life was what his line was. But that's something that the game show, What's My Line, didn't understand, because What's My Line was a reflection of the work values that we're familiar with, especially in the United States, that your occupation is you, is your identity. And this is really why this is one of the central rules of Life's Potluck Buffet, because our work-life identities are simply one part of our identity. And this is something that Salvador Dali knew implicitly, and that's something that the panelists and the game show they were on did not know. And when these two viewpoints came into collision, the result was hilarious, inspiring, marvelous. It was Salvador Dali. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. And if you like the artwork of Life's Potluck Buffet, head over to lifespotluck.com and pick up a pack today. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.